Imagine a country whose national bank account is, well, it's growing by millions of dollars every single year.
Sounds pretty good, right?
I mean, the spreadsheets look absolutely fantastic. The international reports are glowing. And on paper, this nation is just a textbook success story of modern economic development.
Yeah, a total triumph. On paper.
Exactly, on paper. Because mathematically, behind the scenes, that exact same country is actually getting poorer every single day.
It's a crazy paradox.
It is. The very foundation of its wealth is just vanishing.
Yeah.
And that is the paradoxical, almost impossible reality we are unpacking today.
It really is a phenomenal economic illusion. You know, we're so conditioned to look at a single metric, right?
Right.
Gross domestic product or GDP.
The ultimate scorecard.
Right. And we just assume that if the line is going up, the patient is healthy. But when you look at the Pacific Island small states, that metric is completely blinding us to a much darker structural reality.
So today, we are taking a deep dive into a really comprehensive development analysis report alongside decades of raw macroeconomic data, focused entirely on the Pacific Island small states.
Which we'll probably just refer to as the PSS throughout this conversation, just to keep it simple.
Good call.
Yeah.
The PSS. And our core mission today is to figure out what happens when traditional economic indicators basically lie to you. We're looking at nations that are quite literally overdrafting their futures to pay for today's growth.
Yeah. And what makes this so crucial is that the PSS, they aren't just some, isolated economic anomaly.
Right.
They are a real-time stress test for the entire global economic system. The contradictions they're dealing with today are the exact same contradictions the rest of the industrialized world will have to face in the coming decades.
Which is huge. So if you were listening to this on your commute or, while working around the house, I really want you to hold on to that thought. This isn't just an obscure academic study of remote islands halfway across the globe. This is a masterclass in learning how to look past surface-level wealth.
100%.
If you want to understand the true cost of economic survival in a world where natural resources are finite and, frankly, the climate is shifting, the Pacific Islands are the ultimate test case.
They really are the canary in the coal mine.
Yeah. The lessons buried in this data apply to every single country on Earth, including the one you live in. So let's start untangling this. How does a nation simultaneously grow its income while liquidating its future? Like, where does that dynamic even begin?
Well, it begins with the physical dirt they stand on.
Okay.
You really cannot understand the macroeconomic behavior of the Pacific Island small states without first understanding the severe, almost incomprehensible physical constraints of their geography.
Right, because we are talking about nations scattered across an ocean that covers fully 1/3 of the Earth's surface.
Exactly. But their actual usable land mass is infinitesimally small.
The numbers in the report are honestly hard to wrap your head around at first glance. The total land area of the entire PS region is roughly 62,600 square kilometers.
Which, for context...
Yeah, for our listeners in the U.S., that is basically the size of the state of West Virginia.
Right.
But instead of being one solid connected block of land where you can, build highways and rail networks, that land is shattered into thousands of tiny islands.
Islands, atolls, archipelagos.
Yeah, spread across millions of square miles of open water.
And the logistical nightmare of that fragmentation, it really cannot be overstated.
Oh, I bet.
Like, imagine if you want to move a crate of basic medical supplies or even just building materials from a main administrative island to an outer atoll. You aren't putting it on a truck.
Right. No Amazon Prime delivery there.
Exactly. You are loading it onto a diesel-burning ship, you're navigating unpredictable ocean weather, and dealing with massive transportation premiums. Distance is basically a massive tax on every single economic transaction.
And it isn't just the lack of land or the fragmentation of it. It's the extreme vulnerability of the land they actually do possess.
Yeah, the sea level data is alarming.
The data shows that roughly 14.3% of the rural population in these states lives in low-lying areas that are less than 5 meters above sea level.
And 5 meters is, what, barely the height of a two-story building?
Yeah, basically.
So when you factor in the increasing frequency of storm surges, king tides, and just the accelerating baseline rate of global sea level rise, that 14% of the population is living on the absolute razor's edge of habitability.
It's terrifying. Their physical capital, like their homes, their local roads, community centers, it's all constantly under threat of being washed away.
Which naturally drives people away from the coasts and the outer islands.
Right. And the data shows this massive accelerated push toward urbanization. Urban land has expanded significantly since 2015, reaching roughly 292.56 square kilometers.
Which makes total sense. You have people migrating from the vulnerable outer islands into the main administrative centers, searching for jobs, reliable education, centralized healthcare.
But that creates its own set of problems, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It creates a compounding pressure cooker effect. You have a shrinking amount of safe, arable land and a growing concentration of people packing into tiny urban centers.
And those cities simply don't have the spatial capacity to absorb that kind of population density.
No, it severely strains their infrastructure.
Okay, so let's hold that image of extreme geographic fragility in our minds. Shattered land, rising water, crowded urban centers. Now, let's look at the traditional macroeconomic data the report provides.
The GDP numbers.
Yeah, the GDP of the PSS grew from roughly $3.1 billion back in 1970 to a massive $10.67 billion in 2022.
Which is incredible on the surface.
It's a tripling of the economy. By any standard 20th century metric, taking an economy from $3 billion to nearly $11 billion is a massive triumph.
It looks like a phenomenal trajectory. If you were a foreign investor just skimming the executive summary, you would see that steady upward curve and assume, hey, these nations have figured out a robust formula for growth.
But looking at the chart in the report, right at the year 2020, that steady curve suddenly drops off an absolute cliff.
Yeah, the COVID shock.
The GDP violently contracted by about 11.17% in a single year due to those global shocks. I mean, a double-digit contraction overnight is catastrophic.
It's devastating.
It's like running a retail store where your sales numbers are tripling, but the physical floor space of your store is literally sinking into the ground. Or like building a massive gleaming skyscraper right on top of a major fault line.
Right. The higher you build the floors, the more impressive it looks, but the harder the entire structure falls when the tremor inevitably hits.
Exactly. How long before you have no inventory left to sell?
And that 2020 crash is the perfect illustration of their structural fragility. An 11% drop is the kind of macroeconomic trauma that destroys generational wealth. It takes a decade to recover from something like that.
Right.
And what it reveals is a fundamental truth about the PSS. This economic expansion from $3 billion to $11 billion, it is not anchored in resilient, diversified domestic production.
Because it can't be.
Exactly. It cannot be. They simply do not have the physical landmass, the economies of scale, or the centralized logistical hubs to be manufacturing powerhouses or agricultural giants.
So their entire economy is completely exposed to external global winds. Their very geography dictates that they're price takers, not price makers.
Yes. When global supply chains freeze or when international travel is halted, the PSS don't just experience a mild recession. They experience an economic sudden stop.
Wow.
Their domestic growth is entirely a derivative of global stability.
Okay, so if they lack the physical land for a massive industrial base, and their agriculture is severely constrained by lack of space and, frankly, increasing soil salinity from the ocean, what is actually driving this volatile $10 billion economy?
Yeah, where's the money coming from?
Exactly. What is generating the revenue?
The core engine of their economy is almost entirely dominated by the service sector. The historical data shows that services consistently account for 60 to 70% of their total GDP year after year.
That is a staggering proportion.
It is.
In the industrial sector, which would include things like construction, utilities, maybe whatever light manufacturing they have, that's shrunk to a mere 15%.
Yeah. This is a textbook example of the offshore economy.
The offshore economy.
Right. When a nation cannot easily dig valuable commodities out of the ground and cannot build massive factory complexes because it lacks the physical hinterland and cheap energy, it has to sell something else to the world.
Access.
Exactly. It sells access, it sells experiences, it sells intangible services.
And when we talk about services in the Pacific, we are really talking about the absolute behemoth in the room, which is tourism.
Oh, yeah.
By the 2010s, tourism receipts skyrocketed to represent almost 49.6% of their total exports.
Half.
Let me just pause on that. Literally half of everything these nations exported to the world was essentially a tourist's vacation.
It's wild.
In 2019, right before the crash, international arrivals hit an absolute peak of 1.92 million people.
Think about the sheer scale of that influx. You have almost 2 million people flying into islands whose own indigenous populations are often just a fraction of that number.
It's nuts.
Yeah.
No, I look at those numbers, and part of me wants to criticize the lack of diversification, right? Like, why put all your eggs in one basket?
Sure.
But honestly, pushback here, what else are they supposed to do?
That's the billion-dollar
Yeah.
question.
If you are a policymaker on a tiny island with no iron ore deposits, no vast tracts of land for commercial farming, and a tiny domestic consumer market, catering to tourists isn't just a strategic choice. It is literal survival.
I completely agree.
You lean into the one comparative advantage you actually possess: pristine beaches, warm weather, and beautiful cultures.
It is a completely rational economic choice given their extreme constraints. But the velocity at which this offshore economy traps them is profound.
Yeah.
They have been forced into this structure, and while it generated that massive GDP growth, it required them to sacrifice almost all economic autonomy.
They effectively outsource their macroeconomic stability to the disposable income of, like, middle-class families in Australia, Asia, and North America.
That is the vulnerability right there. When the 2020 cliff drop in arrivals happened, it essentially halved their export revenues overnight.
Just gone.
Imagine your own household income being slashed by 50% in a single day with zero warning. You still have your mortgage, your grocery bills, your car payments. That is exactly what happened to these sovereign nations at a macro level.
Tourism is an incredible economic lifeline, but it operates as a highly volatile mechanism, a double-edged sword. I want to explore the physical footprint of that 1.92 million tourists, too. Because we see the revenue they bring in, but think about the sheer infrastructure required to host them.
It's massive.
If you have to build massive, sprawling resorts on very limited land, which requires importing thousands of tons of concrete and steel.
Empowering those resorts.
Right. You need to power them with constant air conditioning. You need millions of gallons of fresh water for swimming pools, daily sheet washing, and tourist showers.
And food.
Yeah, you have to import massive quantities of food to stock the resort buffets, because local island agriculture cannot possibly scale to feed 2 million temporary visitors.
And that infrastructure creates an intense compounding strain on the local ecosystem. The pristine natural environment that tourists are paying premium prices to experience is slowly degraded by the very concrete and resource-heavy infrastructure built to accommodate them.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. The tourism industry in a small island state inevitably consumes the natural capital that forms its own foundation.
Which brings us directly to the core mathematical paradox we opened the show with. We've spent a lot of time talking about what's flowing into the islands, right? The millions of tourists, the foreign capital, the $10 billion GDP.
Right.
Let's shift gears and look at what is actively being taken out of the natural environment to sustain that illusion of growth. We really need to talk about adjusted net savings.
This is the most crucial analytical framework in the entire report. If you want to understand whether a country is actually building sustainable wealth or just burning through its inheritance, you have to look beyond traditional gross savings.
Okay, let's define gross savings first so everyone is on the same page. Gross savings is essentially the difference between a nation's gross national income and its total public and private consumption.
Right.
And according to the report, the gross savings rate for the PSS actually looks incredibly healthy on paper. In some years, it hits 20 to 30% of their GNI.
Which is huge.
Yeah. If you only looked at that one metric, you would conclude these countries are fiscally disciplined powerhouses, saving a quarter of their income.
But the problem is that standard macroeconomic accounting is deeply flawed.
How so?
It treats the natural world as an infinite free resource. It treats the environment like a checking account where you can make endless withdrawals without ever recording a lower balance.
Oh, wow.
This is where adjusted net savings, or ANS, steps in to forcefully correct the record.
Walk us through how ANS is actually calculated. What are the specific deductions it makes against that 20 to 30% gross savings?
So ANS takes that gross savings number and starts systematically subtracting the hidden costs of economic growth. The first major deduction is the consumption of fixed capital.
Meaning?
This is essentially the physical depreciation of roads, buildings, seawalls, and infrastructure. Things wear out rapidly, especially in a highly corrosive, salty, humid, cyclone-prone oceanic environment.
Okay, physical wear and tear makes sense, but it goes deeper than concrete, doesn't it?
Much deeper. The next deduction is for natural capital depletion, starting with minerals.
Right.
If a small island nation mines a ton of phosphate or copper and exports it, traditional GDP records that transaction as pure economic growth. But your actual national wealth has diminished because you have one less ton of finite mineral to sell tomorrow, ANS subtracts the value of that depleted mineral from your savings.
It does the same thing for forests, right?
Exactly.
If you clear-cut attractive tropical mahogany, you get a massive short-term cash injection that boosts your GDP for the year. But you permanently lose the future value of that timber.
Not to mention the loss of watershed protection, the soil erosion, the destruction of biodiversity.
Exactly. ANS deducts that loss.
The final and perhaps most telling deduction for the modern era is the subtraction damages caused by particulate emissions and carbon dioxide emissions.
Sure.
ANS assigns a strict mathematical economic penalty for the long-term health and environmental costs of pollution.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's like gross savings is checking your bank account after payday and feeling rich. ANS is realizing you still have to pay off a massive credit card debt, and oh, your house needs a new roof.
That is the perfect analogy.
So wealth is an illusion.
Yeah.
You might have cash in the register tonight, but your business is mathematically doomed.
And when you apply that rigorous ANS math to the Pacific Island small states, the illusion of wealth shatters. The data reveals that their ANS has frequently plunged deep into negative territory over the last decade.
Negative territory.
Yes. Furthermore, the specific deductions for CO2 damage and particulate emission damages are actively rising year over year.
I want to make sure the gravity of a negative ANS lands with the listener. If ANS is negative, it isn't just a minor accounting quirk.
No, not at all.
It is a mathematical certainty that the nation is becoming poorer over time, completely, regardless of how high their GDP climbs. They are systematically converting irreplaceable natural capital into short-term cash.
This raises an important question. Are these nations actually growing or just liquidating their assets? The economic growth we marvel at on the charts is essentially masking the rapid, unsustainable depletion of their environmental assets. The tragic irony here is that their current development model forces them to cannibalize the very environmental systems that shield them from climate impacts.
Like what?
Like, destroying a coastal mangrove forest to build a luxury tourist resort might provide a fantastic GDP boost this year, but it completely removes the natural storm barrier. That guarantees the next cyclone will cause exponentially more economic devastation.
It's so short-sighted, but again, driven by survival. So to make this abstract environmental depletion more concrete, let's pivot to the most vital natural resource of the Pacific, the ocean itself.
The ocean is their true economic hinterland. It is the bank vault of the Pacific.
Yeah.
And the data detailing how they are currently utilizing this vault is one of the most alarming sections of the entire report.
The report tracks a massive, unprecedented explosion in capture fisheries. Fishery production in the PSS leaped from just 15,200 tons back in 1960 to an astonishing 637,000 tons in the 2020s.
That is an astronomical increase in yield. It represents a fundamental structural shift from subsistence, localized artisanal fishing, to industrial-scale global extraction.
Going from 15,000 to over 600,000 tons, it's like upgrading from an artisanal bakery to a megafactory overnight. But the ingredients are running out.
Exactly.
I am trying to visualize how a collection of small island nations even physically manages to pull over 600,000 tons of fish out of the water every year.
Yeah.
They don't possess massive industrialized trawler fleets of their own. How is this extraction actually happening?
It is largely driven by distant water fishing fleets from foreign nations. The PSS sell access.
Just like the tourism.
Right. They sign licensing agreements allowing massive factory ships from Asia, Europe, or the Americas to enter their exclusive economic zones, scoop up massive quantities of tuna and other species, and leave.
Wow.
The PSS government collects a licensing fee, which boosts their gross national income, but the actual physical resource, the biological wealth, is permanently removed from their ecosystem.
Wait, so they pull out 637,000 tons of marine life?
Yeah.
At what point does the ocean just say, we're empty? There has to be an ecological limit to that kind of extraction.
The data strongly suggests we are colliding with that limit right now. The report highlights a glaring ecological red flag. The number of threatened fish species in these waters has surged to 314.
314 species on the brink.
This is where we have to talk about ecological carrying capacity.
Okay, what's that?
Carrying capacity is the maximum population size of a biological species that a specific environment can sustain indefinitely. In macroeconomic terms, it is the maximum yield you can safely extract without destroying your principal capital.
So like a trust fund.
Exactly. If you have a massive trust fund earning 5% interest, you can spend that 5% every year forever. But the moment you start spending 10%, you are eating into the principal. Eventually, the account goes to absolute zero.
So pulling 637,000 tons of fish out of the Pacific every single year is them rapidly eating into their biological principle.
Yes. This isn't just a sustainability issue in the soft environmentalist sense. It is a looming sovereign default on their blue wealth. The explosive yield we are tracking has almost certainly exceeded the absolute limit of what the Pacific Ocean can naturally regenerate.
That is sobering.
Having 314 threatened species means you are violently destabilizing the entire oceanic food web. When apex predators or keystone species collapse, the entire fishery doesn't just slowly decline, it can experience a sudden, nonlinear collapse.
Let's ground that in reality for the listener. If your local supermarket goes bankrupt, it's an inconvenience. You drive 10 miles to the next town.
Right.
But if the Pacific fishery collapses, these island populations have no next town. Fish is the primary foundational source of protein for a massive percentage of the indigenous population.
Yeah, food security is intrinsically tied to this.
If the foreign factory fleets vacuum up the last of the viable stock, the local artisanal fisherman in a wooden canoe has nothing left to catch.
Which brings us right back to why a negative adjusted net savings is so incredibly dangerous. The licensing cash they receive today looks fantastic on the GNI ledger. It pays for government salaries and imports. But the rapid depletion of those fish stocks, the permanent loss of that natural capital, means the future generations of the PSS are inheriting an empty ocean.
The physical environment, the shrinking land, and the emptying ocean is buckling under the pressure of this economic model. But what about the people actually navigating this reality? To truly understand an economy, you have to look closely at its human capital.
Absolutely.
Let's shift our focus to the human element.
Macroeconomics is ultimately driven by demographics, and the demographic shifts happening in the Pacific are incredibly complex.
Yeah.
They're effectively caught between two different demographic eras at the exact same time.
Let's look at the specific numbers from the report. The elderly dependency ratio, which is the number of people over age 65 relative to the working age population, is steadily climbing. It went from 6.7% in 1960 to over 8.4% today. The population is visibly starting to age. Meanwhile, the youth dependency ratio, children under 15, is dropping significantly. It fell from a staggering 92% down to 61%.
Historically, the PSS had a massive youth bulge. Every single working adult was effectively supporting almost one full child.
Which is a huge financial strain.
Huge. That immense burden is finally easing as birth rates decline. In a normal economic development cycle, this triggers a demographic dividend, a massive economic boom, because you suddenly have a larger proportion of adults working, earning, and saving, with fewer children requiring food, clothing, and schooling.
But a youth dependency ratio of 61% is still an incredibly heavy burden by modern global standards, right?
Exactly. The working age adults are getting brutally squeezed from both ends. They are still financially supporting a large youth population, and now they are increasingly having to pay for the care and medical needs of a growing elderly population.
To survive that squeeze, those prime age workers need to be highly productive. They need high-paying jobs. And securing high-paying jobs requires advanced education.
This is where we run into a massive structural bottleneck. The data on education in the PSS reveals a story of incredible early success that crashes into a sudden, debilitating wall.
The report shows that primary education is a massive, undeniable triumph. They have achieved a 94.1% graduation rate for primary school.
That's a logistical miracle, honestly.
It really is. Almost every single child in these scattered island nations is receiving foundational literacy and numeracy. But then you look at tertiary education, higher education, university degrees, advanced technical training, and the gross enrollment rate absolutely plummets to just 29.3%.
That bottleneck restricts the growth potential of the entire economy. Achieving near-universal primary education is an incredible feat, but it only prepares a workforce for low-level service jobs or subsistence agriculture.
Right, cleaning hotel rooms or farming.
Exactly. If a nation wants to transition out of the offshore tourism trap and into a high-value, knowledge-based digital economy, it requires a workforce armed with tertiary degrees. They need software engineers, marine biologists, advanced healthcare administrators, complex project managers. A 29% tertiary enrollment rate means the vast majority of the human capital is capping out at high school level skills.
I want to explore why that drop-off is so severe. If a student wants a university degree, they often have to leave their home island. They have to fly to a main administrative center or more likely fly internationally to Australia or New Zealand.
And the cost is astronomical.
Yeah. And here is the brutal mechanism of the brain drain. If a student does manage to get that rare engineering degree in Sydney, why would they move back to an atoll that only offers jobs cleaning resort hotel rooms?
You stay in Sydney.
They stay in Sydney. The island nation paid for the primary education, but a foreign country reaps the economic benefit of the highly skilled adult worker.
And it actively deters foreign direct investment as well. Global technology or finance companies will not set up advanced regional headquarters in the PSS if they cannot source a deep pool of local, highly trained talent.
As difficult as that education bottleneck is, the data gets even more perplexing when you break it down by gender. We have to talk about the gender paradox in the Pacific because this completely stopped me in my tracks.
It is arguably one of the most striking and frustrating systemic failures highlighted in the entire dataset.
When you look at the gender parity index in higher education, women are actually pulling ahead. In that small 29% cohort of the population that does make it to tertiary education, women are actively outperforming men.
They are earning the degrees, they're highly educated and highly capable.
Yet when you look at the labor market data, the female labor force participation rate is only 51.5%. Meanwhile, the male labor force participation rate is 73.2%.
The disconnect between those two data sets is profound.
I am genuinely struggling to understand this mechanism. You have an economy desperate for high-skilled labor. You have women who are highly educated, actively outperforming their male peers in universities.
Yeah.
But half of them are completely missing from the formal workforce. In an economy desperate for growth, that seems like leaving your best players on the bench. What is driving this?
It is a massive structural and cultural failure to translate educational equity into labor market equity. The state and families are investing scarce resources to educate these women, but the economic structure actively prevents them from participating.
How so?
This is driven by deep-seated expectations regarding unpaid domestic labor, a near-total lack of formal childcare infrastructure, and pervasive traditional patriarchal norms that discourage women from entering certain formal economic sectors or leadership roles.
So the women get the degrees, but when they return home, the society expects them to manage the household, care for the 61% youth population, and care for the growing 8.4% elderly population.
They become the unpaid social safety net.
What does this do to the macroeconomy?
It artificially and severely suppresses their national GDP. Eliminating these workplace barriers could trigger a massive gender dividend. Imagine the economic shockwave if the PSS could simply bring female labor force participation up to the male level of 73%.
That would be huge.
You would instantly inject a wave of highly educated, highly productive workers into the formal economy. It would be like discovering a massive, fully funded reserve account you forgot you had.
Wow.
That sudden influx of productivity and tax revenue could completely offset the burdens of the aging population and bridge the severe skills gap.
But there is another invisible force keeping people, both men and women, out of the workforce. And it has nothing to do with education or cultural norms or the health of the ocean.
Right.
It is a crisis happening inside the biology of the population itself. Let's transition to what the report accurately identifies as the hidden crisis.
When analysts discuss human capital, the conversation almost always defaults to education and skills training. But the absolute bedrock of human capital is basic biological health.
Of course.
And the public health data emerging from the PSS is nothing short of an internal emergency.
I need to lay out this staggering health data clearly for the listener. The report tracked the probability of dying from non-communicable diseases. We are talking about NCDs, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, chronic respiratory diseases, and cancer.
The big killers.
Yeah. For people between the ages of 30 and 70 in the PSS, the risk of dying from an NCD sits at a persistently high 30%. For men, the numbers are even more devastating. The risk of death is 41.9%.
Let the sheer statistical weight of that sink in. A 40% chance for a man to die between the ages of 30 and 70 from a disease that is largely preventable or manageable.
When you, the listener, hear news stories about the Pacific Islands, you probably think the biggest existential threat is climate change. You picture a rising ocean violently wiping out the coastlines.
And that is a real existential threat.
It is. But a 30 to 40% chance of premature death from a preventable disease, that is a slow-motion internal emergency, a tsunami tearing through the population's arteries. Why is this happening on such a massive scale?
It ties directly back to our earlier analysis of geography and the offshore economy.
Really? How?
As these islands shifted away from subsistence farming toward urbanization and a service-based economy, their food systems fundamentally transformed. The traditional Pacific diet, which was incredibly healthy, rich in fresh pelagic fish, local root vegetables like taro and fresh fruits, was almost entirely displaced by highly processed imported foods.
Because of the logistical realities we discussed earlier, if your soil is becoming too salty to farm due to sea level rise, and your ocean is being vacuumed by foreign fleets for export, what are the locals supposed to eat? It is vastly cheaper and logistically easier to import a shipping container full of canned meats, instant noodles, and refined sugar. A pallet of canned Spam can sit on a humid dock for a year without spoiling. A crate of fresh broccoli rots in 3 days and requires a highly expensive, refrigerated supply chain.
The explosion of NCDs is the direct biological consequence of their geographic isolation and their integration into cheap global food supply chains. But to truly understand the impact, we have to connect this public health crisis back to the macroeconomy.
Right.
High NCD rates act as an absolute wrecking ball to human capital.
Walk us through the specific economic compounding effect. How does a diabetes or heart disease epidemic physically drain a nation's wealth?
Look at the age bracket affected, 30 to 70 years old. These are our nation's prime earning years. These are the highly experienced managers, the veteran teachers, the senior civil servants, the skilled tradespeople.
The core of the workforce.
Right. When a 45-year-old suffers a debilitating stroke from untreated hypertension or requires a foot amputation due to advanced diabetes, the economy doesn't just lose a worker. It instantly loses decades of accumulated expertise and productivity. They are forcibly removed from the labor pool at the exact moment they should be at their most economically valuable.
The national economy loses the workers' output. But the financial bleeding doesn't stop there, does it?
No, it compounds viciously at the household level. Not only does the family lose the primary breadwinner's income, but they are suddenly saddled with the exorbitant costs of chronic medical care. The report specifically notes that out-of-pocket medical expenses surged dramatically in 2020.
Wow.
Because the state healthcare systems are overwhelmed, the financial burden is shifted directly onto the citizens.
So whatever meager savings a household might have carefully accumulated, perhaps the exact money they were saving to send their daughter to a tertiary university in Australia, is instantly drained to pay for daily insulin, expensive imported heart medications, or prolonged hospital stays.
It creates an inescapable poverty trap. The macroeconomy loses the labor, the household loses its income, and then the family's wealth is liquidated by out-of-pocket health costs. This prevents the next generation from accessing higher education, guaranteeing the cycle repeats. NCDs are not just individual medical tragedies, they are a profound, systemic drag on the economic productivity of the entire region.
To solve a crisis of this magnitude, overhauling a national food supply chain, delivering modern health care to remote outer islands, and upgrading an education system, a nation needs physical power and digital connection. Let's examine how the PSS power their economies and connect to the outside world.
The infrastructure data presents a fascinating duality. We see a massive, frustrating failure of transition in the energy sector, paired directly alongside a brilliant leapfrog success in telecommunications.
Let's start with the frustrating part, the energy trap. The PSS are on the absolute, literal front lines of climate change vulnerability.
They are the moral conscience of the world at every United Nations climate summit.
They absolutely are. Yet, the data shows that a staggering 57.4% of their electricity production still relies on burning imported fossil fuels. Yeah. And the growth of renewable energy capacity is severely lagging behind targets.
It is a bitter, deeply ironic reality. To keep the lights on in their hospitals, to treat the NCD epidemic, and to keep the air conditioning running in the resorts that power their GDP, they are forced to burn diesel.
It's a bizarre irony.
They are actively contributing to the very carbon emissions that are melting the ice caps and threatening to submerge their own homes.
Why haven't they transitioned to solar or wind? I mean, they have abundant sunshine and ocean breezes.
Right.
Why are they stuck in this fossil fuel dependency?
Because importing fossil fuels creates what we can call a dual macroeconomic trap. The first part of the trap is severe capital flight.
Capital flight, okay.
Every single gallon of diesel burned in a generator in the Pacific has to be purchased on the global market using hard foreign currency, usually US dollars. It then has to be loaded onto a specialized tanker and shipped across thousands of miles of ocean, adding exorbitant transportation premiums.
Which eats into their reserves.
Exactly. A massive percentage of the wealth they generate from tourism flows right back out of the country to pay foreign oil conglomerates. It constantly drains their foreign exchange reserves.
The second part of the trap is the environmental cost, which we saw mathematically penalized in the negative adjusted net savings data. So why not just build solar farms and stop importing diesel?
Because overhauling a national energy grid requires massive upfront capital expenditure. You have to buy the solar panels, the massive battery storage arrays, and upgrade the transmission lines.
And we just established they have no savings.
Right. As we discussed, their national savings are depleted, and their households are draining wealth to pay for healthcare. To build a solar grid, they have to borrow money on the international market. But because they are small, geographically vulnerable nations, international lenders attach massive risk premiums to the loans. The interest rates are punishingly high.
So they are trapped paying exorbitant daily costs for diesel because they cannot afford the massive upfront cost of the clean energy cure. It is incredibly frustrating. But on the flip side, you mentioned a bright spot. Their digital infrastructure is creating virtual bridges where physical ones are impossible. The report details an incredible success story, the digital leap.
This is where things get genuinely hopeful.
The data shows that fixed broadband subscriptions have grown exponentially, from just a few thousand connections in the early 2000s to over 42,400 today. Furthermore, internet usage penetration is actually reaching gender parity.
This data point is the blueprint for their entire future. It represents a total paradigm shift in how they can interact with the global economy.
We talked earlier about how incredibly expensive it is to build physical infrastructure. It costs an absolute fortune to dredge a deep-water port or pour concrete for an airport runway on a remote coral atoll.
Prohibitively expensive.
But laying a submarine fiber optic cable along the ocean floor changes the rules of the game entirely.
The strategic value of this digital boom is that it offers a viable escape route from the physical offshore tourism trap. If you have reliable, high-speed broadband, you no longer require 2 million tourists to physically fly to your fragile island, consume your scarce fresh water, and trample your delicate reef systems.
You can pivot the service economy away from physical extraction and toward remote, high-value, low-impact digital services.
Exactly. We are talking about integrating into the global remote workforce. Telemedicine, international customer support, remote software development, data analysis, digital accounting.
And recall our discussion about the gender paradox. You have a massive cohort of highly educated women sitting outside the formal labor force due to local structural and cultural barriers.
Yep.
High-speed digital infrastructure allows those women to integrate directly into the global workforce for their own homes or community centers.
Yeah.
They can completely bypass the inflexible traditional local labor market. The internet is the exact mechanism they need to monetize their human capital without further depleting their natural capital.
It's the perfect solution to that specific bottleneck.
But transitioning energy grids and building digital networks takes capital. Where is that money coming from?
It comes from the outside. And that brings us to the final and perhaps most precarious structural pillar of the PSS economy, the fiscal lifeline of foreign aid and international debt.
Let's look closely at the financial reliance data. It is extreme. Net official development assistance, which is the formal macroeconomic term for foreign aid, often abbreviated as ODA, skyrocketed from just $19 per capita back in 1960 to a staggering $633 per capita in 2022.
I want the listener to really internalize that figure. $633 for every single man, woman, and child in the country, every single year.
I'm pausing on that number because it fundamentally changes how we view these economies. That level of ODA isn't a temporary disaster relief package after a cyclone. It is a permanent structural life support system.
Yes, it is.
And while that aid money is flowing in, national wealth is simultaneously bleeding out through debt. The report shows that external debt servicing, just paying the interest and principal on their loans, has in certain years consumed over 10% of their total export revenues.
A massive chunk of change.
So what does this all mean? If a nation requires a $633 per person allowance from the international community just to stay afloat, can it ever truly chart its own independent economic course?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it is the most brutally difficult geopolitical question they face. This extreme level of dependence on foreign aid means their fiscal resilience is paper thin.
Right.
It intimately ties their domestic survival to the political whims of foreign capitals.
Yeah.
A global recession in the United States, Europe, or Asia doesn't just hurt Pacific tourism arrivals, it threatens their foundational fiscal lifeline. When rich countries experience economic downturns, foreign aid budgets are almost always the very first thing slashed.
And when the grant money dries up, the PSS governments have to take on even more high-interest debt just to pay their civil servants and keep the hospitals open. And then debt servicing eats up an even larger percentage of their exports, leaving even less money for tertiary education or NCD prevention. It is a vicious, tightening cycle.
And we have to acknowledge the geopolitical reality of how ODA functions, too.
Oh, absolutely.
That $633 per capita isn't always given out of pure altruistic charity. Aid is a mechanism of global influence. It often comes with heavy, invisible strings attached.
High ODA dependence is a massive strategic vulnerability. Major global powers utilize aid to secure geopolitical footholds in the Pacific. It means that domestic PSS policy is frequently shaped by the strategic priorities of the foreign donors rather than the actual urgent needs of the local population.
Let's explore the mechanics of how that influence actually plays out on the ground. A foreign donor country might offer a $50 million grant, but the stipulation is that the money must be used to build a massive, highly visible sports stadium or a massive new administrative building.
Using construction firms and imported labor from the donor country, naturally.
Naturally, the money flows onto the PSS ledger as aid, but immediately flows right back out to foreign contractors. The local population gets a shiny new stadium they have to maintain, when what they desperately needed was a decentralized solar microgrid or a massive public health campaign to fight diabetes.
The donor gets a ribbon-cutting ceremony and a loyal voting bloc in the United Nations. The island gets the long-term maintenance bill.
That dynamic perfectly encapsulates why true economic sovereignty is so elusive for the PSS. Until they can internally finance their own development, they remain vulnerable to the strategic chess games of larger nations.
We have covered an immense, complex landscape today. We started with the mathematical paradox of GDP growth, masking the depletion of environmental wealth.
Right.
We mapped out the severe physical constraints of their fragmented geography, the volatile trap of the offshore tourism economy, the emptying of the ocean's blue wealth, the demographic squeeze.
The paradox of highly educated women locked out of the workforce.
Yes, the internal biological tsunami of non-communicable diseases, the dual trap of fossil fuels, and this overwhelming precarious reliance on foreign aid. Let's try to synthesize all of these interconnected threads. The report outlines a path forward, calling it the blue future. What does a viable future actually look like for these nations?
To survive the coming decades, the Pacific Islands small states must execute a fundamental systemic pivot. They have to transition away from what we can accurately call overdraft growth and move toward genuine, resilient development.
Right.
The current mathematical model simply does not pencil out over a 50-year horizon. Based on the data we have unpacked, that pivot requires 4 critical, interconnected actions.
Step 1 has to be stopping the massive drain on their adjusted net savings. They absolutely cannot keep treating the Pacific Ocean and their coastal forests as an infinite, consequence-free ATM.
No, they can't.
The depletion of their natural capital, the loss of those 314 threatened fish species, must be rigorously priced into their national economic planning.
Step 2 is an upgrade of their economic engine. They must leverage that growing, high-speed digital infrastructure to pivot the economy away from high-impact, physically destructive mass tourism and into high-value, low-environmental impact digital services. They have to export data and expertise, not their own natural resources.
Step 3 requires unleashing their locked human capital. They have to integrate that massive cohort of highly educated women into the formal workforce. Eliminating the cultural and structural barriers to female labor participation is the absolute fastest, most effective way to unlock a demographic dividend, increase domestic tax revenues, and offset the immense financial burden of their aging population.
And finally, step 4 is a sprint toward renewable energy independence. Breaking the addiction to imported diesel fuel is the only way to stop the massive capital flight draining their foreign reserves. Securing their own clean energy grid isn't just an environmental goal, it is the foundational requirement for true economic sovereignty.
I want to talk directly to you, the listener, as we bring this deep dive to a close. The macroeconomic story of the Pacific Island small states is not just a tragedy of geography. They are not merely passive victims waiting for the ocean water to rise. They are, in fact, the ultimate high-stakes laboratory for the future of the global economy.
That's a great way to put it.
Think about the severe constraints they are battling today. The rapid depletion of finite natural resources, the structural economic pressures of an aging population, the devastating public health impacts of modern, highly processed food systems, and the desperate, urgent need to transition to clean energy. These are the exact same systemic constraints that the entire industrialized globe will have to face in the coming decades.
The PSS are simply experiencing these pressures first, and far more acutely, because of their extreme geographic isolation and small size. But if they can solve this incredibly complex puzzle, if they can figure out how to generate sustainable economic growth without mathematically depleting the nature that sustains them, they will provide a vital blueprint for the rest of the world to follow.
Which leads me to a final lingering thought for you to mull over as you go about your day. Think back to the very beginning of our conversation. Think about that powerful, revealing metric, adjusted net savings.
It really changes everything.
It does. If the very definition of wealth fundamentally changes when we are forced to truly, mathematically price in the cost of nature, the carbon emissions, the deforestation, the extraction of finite minerals, the collapse of biodiversity, it shifts our entire perspective on the global order.
Completely.
Are the world's richest, most heavily industrialized nations actually the wealthiest? Or, when exposed to the harsh, clarifying light of adjusted net savings, are they actually running the largest, most dangerous environmental deficits in human history?
It completely flips the script on who is actually developing a sustainable civilization and who is simply running a massive overdraft account on tomorrow.
What do you think your own country's true balance sheet looks like? If we put your nation's massive GDP through that exact same rigorous environmental accounting, would it show a clean, strong foundation of genuine wealth, or would it reveal a landscape that is dangerously, fundamentally hollow? We will leave you to explore that question on your own. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.